In his later years, mornings became quiet. A man sat by the window, listening to familiar melodies that felt closer than the faces around him. The music still reached him, but names, places, and moments often slipped away before he could hold them. Few remembered that this gentle figure had once been one of the most recognizable voices in American music, applauded across decades, across generations. For most of his life, millions knew his name by heart. Fame had lifted him to extraordinary heights. Yet time introduced a fracture no standing ovation could repair, and it raises a haunting question. When memory fades, what remains of a life, and who stays when the spotlight is gone? This is the story of Tony Bennett. Tony Bennett was born Anthony Dominic Benedetto on August 3, 1926, in the Astoria neighborhood of Queens, New York. He arrived into a world shaped by immigration, economic struggle, and the fragile hope of working-class families trying to survive in America between two world wars. His parents were Italian immigrants. His father, John Benedetto, worked as a grocery clerk and carried a deep love for music, especially opera. His mother, Anna Sorazzi, was a seamstress who held the household together with discipline and quiet endurance. Music was not a luxury in the Benedetto home. It was a refuge. Songs filled the small apartment not as entertainment, but as emotional language when words failed. That refuge shattered early. When Tony was 10 years old, his father died suddenly. The loss left a permanent mark. Overnight, childhood innocence was replaced by responsibility, uncertainty, and a sense of absence that never fully healed. His mother now worked long hours to support the family, leaving Tony to navigate grief largely on his own. This early encounter with loss mattered. Years later, those close to him would describe Tony as someone deeply driven by the need to be seen, heard, and remembered, not out of vanity, but out of fear of disappearance. The death of his father introduced a silent question that followed him through life. What remains when someone is gone? Music became both comfort and compass. As a teenager, Tony sang wherever he could, school events, small gatherings, local contests. He studied art and music, drawn to beauty as a counterweight to grief. Yet even in those early years, there was a tension forming between who he was and who he needed to become to survive. In 1944, still barely 18, Tony was drafted into the United States Army during World War II. The war exposed him to violence, death, and moral disorientation at an age when most young men are still discovering themselves. He later described frontline combat as terrifying and transformative. The experience reinforced his belief that life was fragile and that moments of meaning could vanish without warning. When the war ended, Tony returned home older than his years. The boy who once sang for comfort now understood music as something more urgent, a way to assert presence in a world that erased people without ceremony. He studied at the American Theater Wing under the GI Bill, training his voice seriously for the first time. Yet beneath the discipline and ambition, the emotional architecture of his childhood remained. The early loss of a parent, combined with long periods of emotional self-reliance, shaped his relationships with intimacy, authority, and approval. Tony learned to stand alone early, and he learned to perform strength even when he felt vulnerable. This background would later matter deeply. As fame entered his life, it did not arrive in a vacuum. It entered a man already conditioned to equate visibility with safety, applause with reassurance, and silence with loss. The stage did not simply offer opportunity, it offered protection against being forgotten. Family relationships in his early life were loving but strained by circumstance. Survival left little room for emotional reflection. Like many men of his generation, Tony was not taught to speak openly about grief. Instead, he sang it. Looking back, the foundation of his later life was already set in these early years. A child who lost a father too soon. A young man who saw death up close. An artist who learned that music could hold memory when the world could not. And beneath it all lingered a question that would grow heavier with time. If music could preserve moments, could it also preserve a self, especially when memory itself began to fade? When Tony Bennett returned to New York after the war, he carried more than discipline and ambition. He carried urgency. Having seen how quickly life could disappear, he no longer treated music as a dream to be postponed. It became a necessity. Using the benefits of the GI Bill, he enrolled at the American Theater Wing, studying voice with seriousness and restraint. Unlike many aspiring singers of the time, Tony was not chasing novelty. He was drawn to timelessness. He admired the clarity of classic phrasing, the emotional honesty of standards, and the idea that a song should feel lived in rather than performed. The early years were not glamorous. He sang wherever opportunity allowed. Small clubs, radio auditions, modest venues where applause was uncertain and paychecks were thin. Rejection was frequent. Producers often told him his style was old-fashioned, that popular music was moving toward something louder and more immediate. But Tony resisted reinvention for convenience. His voice, warm and unforced, reflected his temperament. He did not sing to dominate a room. He sang to connect. That choice would slow his rise, but it would also define his legacy. A crucial turning point came when comedian Bob Hope heard Tony perform and recognized something rare, a singer who sounded authentic without excess. Hope invited him to tour, exposing Tony to national audiences for the first time. It was not instant stardom, but it was validation. Someone influential had seen him, and that mattered deeply. Soon after, Tony signed his first recording contract. The name Anthony Benedetto was replaced with Tony Bennett, a simpler identity built for public memory. The change was practical but symbolic. A private self stepped aside to make room for a public one. His early recordings began to find an audience. Songs like Because of You introduced listeners to a voice that felt both intimate and dignified. Unlike the emerging rock and roll energy, Bennett's sound carried restraint, emotional precision, and a sense of permanence. Success arrived gradually, almost quietly. There were no explosive debuts, no overnight fame. Instead, there was steady growth, each performance reinforcing the last. This suited Tony's temperament. He trusted accumulation over spectacle. Yet even as recognition grew, so did dependence on it. Applause became confirmation not just of talent, but of existence. Each performance reassured him that he was present, relevant, remembered. In subtle ways, the stage began to function as emotional shelter. Behind the scenes, Tony worked relentlessly. He studied phrasing, respected composers, and avoided shortcuts. His discipline earned respect among musicians, but it also fostered a life organized around work. Balance was secondary. The craft came first. This period also marked the beginning of a lifelong tension, how to remain visible without losing oneself. The industry demanded consistency, appearances, and productivity. Silence, time away from the public, was treated as risk. For Tony, silence had always been dangerous. It reminded him of absence, of childhood loss, of the war's erasures. Music filled those spaces. Performing kept the world at a distance. As his career gained momentum, the pattern was set. He would build a life around being heard. The applause would grow louder, and gradually the idea of stepping away, of not being remembered, would become unthinkable. In these early professional years, Tony Bennett learned not only how to sing for an audience, but how to anchor his identity to their response. The craft gave him purpose. Fame gave him reassurance. What he could not yet see was how fragile that reassurance might become, especially if the day ever came when memory itself could no longer recognize the voice that once defined him. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Tony Bennett had reached a place few singers ever do. He was no longer simply successful. He was trusted. His voice became a fixture in American homes, his presence associated with elegance, control, and emotional clarity. At a time when popular music was rapidly changing, Bennett stood as a bridge between eras. His performances were precise but never cold. He sang with restraint, allowing emotion to surface without excess. Audiences felt that he respected the song as much as he respected them. That respect earned him longevity in an industry that rarely rewards patience. During these years, Bennett recorded and performed relentlessly. Concert halls filled, television appearances multiplied. His name appeared alongside the most respected musicians of his generation. Awards followed, not as sudden triumphs, but as confirmations of a reputation carefully built. Publicly, he embodied stability. Privately, the pace was unforgiving. The demand to remain present, to show up, to sing, to smile, created a life structured around constant visibility. Success required repetition. Each year needed new recordings, new tours, new confirmations that the voice still mattered. The applause never lasted long enough to feel secure. As younger artists emerged and musical trends shifted, Bennett faced a choice. He could chase relevance by reshaping himself, or he could hold his ground. He chose the latter. He refused to dilute his style even when commercial pressure mounted. This decision preserved his artistic integrity, but it also narrowed the space between his identity and his work. Tony Bennett did not merely perform classic music, he became its living representative. His value in the public imagination became inseparable from his ability to deliver what people expected. Behind the polished image, the strain accumulated. Touring schedules left little room for rest or reflection. Personal relationships competed with professional obligation. Like many men of his generation, Bennett learned to prioritize endurance over emotional disclosure. There were early signs of imbalance. Financial decisions made under pressure would later carry consequences. Moments of exhaustion were dismissed as temporary. The industry rewarded resilience, not vulnerability. Yet to the audience, none of this was visible. On stage, Bennett appeared timeless. He did not age the way others did. His voice carried the illusion of permanence, as if it could remain unchanged by time. That illusion became a form of protection and a trap. As decades passed, Bennett's career did something rare. It endured. While many contemporaries faded, he adapted without surrendering his core. Collaborations introduced him to younger listeners. A new generation discovered him not as nostalgia, but as authenticity. This late career renaissance reinforced an idea that had guided him since childhood. Being remembered was not optional. Visibility equaled safety. Silence equaled loss. But longevity came at a cost. The longer he remained in the spotlight, the more his sense of self depended on it. The stage was no longer just a workplace. It was confirmation that he still existed as the man he believed himself to be. There were moments when the contrast between image and reality widened. Fatigue increased. The emotional toll of constant performance deepened. Still, Bennett continued. He had learned long ago that stepping back invited uncertainty. Ironically, the very success that made him iconic also postponed confrontation with limits. Fame softened the edges of decline. Applause masked warning signs. As he entered the later chapters of his career, the world saw a singer who had outlasted trends and time itself. What few could see was how much of his identity rested on that endurance. And quietly, without announcement, the conditions were forming for a tragedy no ovation could prevent, one that would challenge the one thing Bennett relied on most, the ability to remember who he was and why the music mattered. If a life is built on being remembered, what happens when memory itself begins to fail? For much of his life, Tony Bennett seemed to defy the passage of time. While others slowed or retreated, he continued to perform, to record, to appear in public with the same composed warmth audiences had come to expect. The voice remained steady. The smile appeared practiced but sincere. To the outside world, endurance looked effortless, but endurance is rarely effortless. It is learned, maintained, and often paid for later. Long before the public knew anything was wrong, the strain of decades in the spotlight had begun to accumulate quietly. Bennett's life had been organized around performance for so long that stillness felt unnatural. When he was not singing, he was preparing to sing again. Rest was transitional, never final. Behind the scenes, the practical realities of a long career weighed heavily. Financial pressures emerged at different stages of his life, shaped by management decisions, tax issues, and the high costs of maintaining visibility in an unforgiving industry. These challenges were not dramatic in isolation, but they created a constant background tension, one that reinforced his belief that he could never truly step away. Emotionally, the pattern was familiar. Whenever uncertainty surfaced, Bennett returned to the stage. Music was not simply his profession, it was his anchor. As long as he could perform, the world made sense. Yet the human body and mind do not negotiate with legacy. Subtle changes began to appear. At first, they were easy to dismiss. Names took longer to come. Dates blurred. Conversations occasionally required gentle reminders. For someone in his 80s, such moments seemed ordinary, hardly alarming. What made them dangerous was how well they could be hidden. Bennett's professionalism masked vulnerability. Years of discipline allowed him to compensate, to rely on muscle memory and instinct. On stage, songs lived in a different part of the brain. Lyrics he had sung for decades emerged intact, even as recent memories faltered. This created a strange contradiction. To audiences, he appeared fully present. Offstage, fragments were slipping. In 2016, Bennett was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The diagnosis was not made public at the time. Those closest to him absorbed the news quietly, restructuring routines, adjusting expectations, protecting his dignity. The decision to keep the diagnosis private was not denial. It was caution. Bennett had built his life on public trust and personal control. Revealing cognitive decline too early risked reducing him to a condition rather than honoring him as a person. And yet, the condition progressed. Alzheimer's does not announce itself loudly. It arrives in layers. One layer removes names, another removes sequences. Eventually, it erodes orientation itself. The disease does not erase skill first. It erases context. For Bennett, this meant that the man who could still deliver a flawless performance might not remember where he was afterward. Applause and confusion began to coexist. The contrast was painful for those around him. Music, once a refuge, now became a reminder of what was being lost. Each successful performance raised the same unspoken question: how long could this last? As time passed, care intensified. Schedules were simplified. Appearances became more selective. Those responsible for his well-being balanced two competing responsibilities: preserving his legacy and preserving his humanity. The public first learned of his diagnosis in 2021. By then, the disease had already reshaped his daily life. The announcement was met not with scandal, but with sorrow and respect. Many recognized in Bennett's story a reflection of their own families, their own fears about aging and memory. That same year, Bennett stepped onto the stage for what would become his final live performances. The setting was grand. The applause was immense. He sang alongside a longtime collaborator, drawing strength from familiarity. On stage, he was alive. His posture straightened. His voice found its place. The audience witnessed something rare and unsettling. A man whose memory was fading, yet whose art remained intact. Behind the curtain, the reality was different. The performance required immense support. He needed guidance, reassurance, and protection. The moment he left the stage, the spell dissolved. Those nights were not celebrations. They were farewells. What made this period tragic was not simply illness. It was the way the illness intersected with the identity Bennett had built. For a man who equated being remembered with being safe, Alzheimer's represented the ultimate contradiction. Fame could not preserve memory. Applause could not anchor identity. The very thing he had trusted most, visibility, was powerless. As his public presence diminished, a different kind of exposure emerged. After his death, legal disputes involving his estate became public. Questions about management, control, and inheritance surfaced, complicating the narrative of a graceful exit. These disputes did not define him, but they revealed a familiar truth. Even the most respected lives leave behind unfinished business. Legacy is never as tidy as performance. In his final years, Bennett lived quietly, surrounded by caregivers and family. Music remained part of his daily routine, not as preparation for the stage, but as comfort. Songs soothed him. They oriented him. In moments when names and faces blurred, melody offered continuity. This was the cruel irony of his condition. The man who feared being forgotten was remembered by the world long after he could remember himself. And perhaps this was also the quiet grace of his ending. Stripped of ambition, competition, and expectation, what remained was something simpler, a human being responding to beauty, a voice recognizing harmony even when language failed. Still, the question lingered, unresolved and unavoidable. If memory defines a life, what happens when memory dissolves? If fame cannot protect us from disappearance, what was it ever worth? Tony Bennett's shadowed years do not diminish his achievements. They deepen them. They remind us that greatness does not exempt anyone from fragility. and that the cost of a life spent being remembered may be confronting the fear of forgetting. There is always a moment in every long life when continuation quietly gives way to conclusion. For Tony Bennett, that moment did not arrive with collapse or scandal. It arrived softly, disguised as dignity. By the late 2000 teens, those closest to him understood what the public could not yet see. Alzheimer's was no longer a background presence. It had crossed a threshold. Daily life required structure. Independence narrowed. The careful balance between performance and protection could not be sustained indefinitely. The question was no longer whether Tony could still sing. It was whether continuing to sing served him, or only the memory of who he had been. For years, the stage had been his anchor. Removing it meant asking him to face stillness, something he had avoided since childhood. Yet keeping it risked, turning his final chapters into spectacle rather than closure. The decision unfolded gradually. Performances were reduced. Travel was limited. Appearances became symbolic rather than routine. Each step back was framed not as retreat, but as preservation. Then came the farewell. In the summer of 2021, Tony Bennett performed what would become his final live concerts. The setting was iconic. The audience was reverent. Many sensed that they were witnessing something irreversible, even if the word final was not spoken aloud. On stage, Bennett appeared composed. His voice, guided by decades of repetition, rose to meet the moment. The music reached him where memory could not. For brief stretches of time he was entirely present, connected to melody, rhythm, and emotion. But once the lights dimmed, reality returned. He did not fully grasp the magnitude of what had occurred. The applause echoed longer in the audience's mind than in his own. These concerts marked the point of no return, not because they ended his career, but because they clarified its limits. From that moment forward, Tony Bennett would no longer be a public performer. The stage that had defined him would no longer define his days. The announcement that followed was gentle. He was stepping away, not due to lack of passion, but due to circumstance. The world responded with respect rather than disappointment. For someone who had spent a lifetime fearing invisibility, this was an unfamiliar experience. Silence arrived not as punishment, but as necessity. In private, life reorganized around care. Familiar routines replaced rehearsals. Music remained present, but its role changed. It was no longer preparation, it was comfort. No longer obligation, it was refuge. This transition carried quiet grief. The loss was not only professional, it was existential. If Tony Bennett was no longer a singer in public, who was he? The answer emerged slowly. Without schedules and expectations, he became simply a man living inside his remaining capacities. Some days were calm, others were disorienting. Progression was uneven, but relentless. The point of no return is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself with certainty. It reveals itself in hindsight when looking back at the last moment something still felt possible. For Tony Bennett, that moment was the final applause. After it faded, what remained was not legacy or reputation. It was vulnerability, dependence, and the quiet truth that even the most enduring voices must eventually rest. And so the question returned, heavier now than ever before. When the spotlight is gone and memory no longer offers refuge, what truly remains of a life built on being remembered? In the years after his final performances, Tony Bennett's life slowed to a rhythm that would have once felt foreign to him. The man who had spent decades moving from stage to stage now lived within carefully shaped routines. Days were quieter. The outside world receded. Alzheimer's does not take everything at once. It rearranges life in fragments. Some mornings were gentle. Music still reached him, often more clearly than conversation. Familiar melodies could calm agitation, soften confusion, and briefly restore a sense of orientation. In those moments, the essence of who he had been felt close, almost reachable. Other moments were harder. Faces he had known for years became unfamiliar. Context slipped. Time folded in on itself. The present could feel disconnected from both past and future. For someone whose identity had been anchored in continuity, tour dates, albums, seasons, this loss was profound. Care became central. The people around him shifted from collaborators to guardians. Their role was no longer to elevate his career, but to protect his dignity. This required patience, repetition, and restraint. Progress was measured not in achievement, but in comfort. The public saw little of this. Tony Bennett's absence was quiet. There were no dramatic headlines, no spectacle. His withdrawal from view mirrored the values he had upheld throughout his life: grace, privacy, restraint. Yet invisibility carries its own weight. For decades, being seen had reassured him that he mattered. Now, days passed without applause or acknowledgement. The silence was not cruel, but it was absolute. The world continued without him, as it always does. Family dynamics, like memory itself, were complex. Caregiving brought closeness and strain in equal measure. Decisions had to be made on his behalf. Authority shifted. Independence narrowed. These changes were necessary, but they underscored the vulnerability of aging. Even for those once considered untouchable, there were moments of recognition, a familiar voice, a song lyric, a phrase spoken with sudden clarity. Those moments were cherished not because they restored the past, but because they affirmed presence. They reminded those around him that something essential remained. Music continued to play a role in his days, though its meaning changed. It was no longer a bridge to an audience. It was a bridge inward. The act of listening became as important as the act of singing once had been. As his condition progressed, the distance between public legacy and private reality widened. The world remembered Tony Bennett as an icon. At home, he was a man navigating confusion, fatigue, and dependence. Both truths existed simultaneously, but they rarely intersected. This is where fame reveals its limits. Recognition cannot substitute companionship. Awards cannot provide orientation. Legacy does not ease the daily work of living with decline. In his final period, Tony Bennett lived without the expectations that had shaped most of his adult life. He did not chase relevance. He did not perform. He did not maintain an image. What remained was simpler and more fragile. Moments of calm mattered more than moments of clarity. Comfort outweighed achievement. Presence, however fleeting, became the measure of a good day. For those watching from a distance, his story offered a quiet mirror. Aging is not a failure. It is a narrowing, a return to essentials. The question is not how much is lost, but what is preserved. Tony Bennett passed away in his mid-90s, having lived with Alzheimer's for several years. His death was met with tributes, retrospectives, and gratitude. The world spoke of his voice, his elegance, his endurance. What it could not fully capture were the ordinary, uncelebrated days at the end, the days that define old age more than any stage ever could. In those days, the spotlight was gone. Memory was unreliable. Fame was distant, and yet something remained, a response to music, a human presence worthy of care, a life that, even in its quietest form, asked the same question it always had. When everything else fades, what truly matters, and who stays? In the end, Tony Bennett's life did not conclude with a final chord held in triumph. It ended quietly, as most lives do, far from the stage, far from the lights that once defined him. The world remembers him as a voice, a symbol of elegance, a bridge between generations. Those memories are real, and they matter. But they are not the whole truth. The fuller truth is more human. In his final years, Tony Bennett lived without the certainty that had guided most of his life. Memory, once the foundation of craft, identity, and continuity, became unreliable. The very thing that allowed him to sing a song with meaning slipped away, one fragment at a time. And yet, something endured. Music still reached him when words could not. Familiar melodies stirred recognition where names failed. In those moments, his life narrowed to something essential: presence without performance, value without validation. This is where his story leaves the realm of celebrity and enters something universal. Fame could not protect him from illness. Legacy could not slow decline. Applause could not accompany him into silence. What mattered most in the end was not how many people remembered him, but whether anyone stayed close enough to care when he could no longer remember himself. Tony Bennett's final chapter asks a question that lingers long after the music fades. When memory disappears, what remains of a person's life? Is it the achievements the world applauded, or the quiet moments of dignity preserved by those who remained? Perhaps the answer is not found in records or awards, but in how gently a life is held when it becomes fragile. In that sense, Tony Bennett did not disappear. He simply arrived at the same place every life eventually does, where fame falls away and only humanity remains. And it is there, in that quiet space, that his story finally rests.